Hey everyone, Kacey Kasem here. I want to take a moment to tell you about Sunday Dreamers Club, my fantasy football inspired t-shirt store. If you're looking for unique, stylish, and comfortable apparel that showcases your love for fantasy football, look no further than SundayDreamersClub.com. Whether you're gearing up for the next big game, hosting a draft party, or just want to sport some awesome gear, Sunday Dreamers Club has got you covered. With a variety of designs and styles to choose from, there's something for every fantasy football fan out there. Your support means the world to me, and there are so many ways you can help me grow this new small business. Grab a shirt or two for yourself or as a gift for your fantasy football league mates, or you can spread the word to your friends and family. Every bit helps, and I truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening, and now let's get back to the show. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Get Real with Kacey Kasem. It's the podcast that goes behind the scenes of the fantasy football industry through interviews with some of your favorites in the business. On this episode, I was joined by Koopa of South Harmon Fantasy Football and the Grinding the Edge podcast to talk about his love for NASCAR and baseball when he was growing up, co-managing a dynasty team for the very first time, his interest in technology, what the WoRP tool is all about, why he goes by the name Koopa, his experience doing a solo podcast, and a ton more. Make sure to check out Koopa on Twitter at Dynasty Koopa. You can follow me at the Kacey Kasem and the podcast at GetReal_pod. You can find my content with Rotoballer, Fantasy Six Pack, and South Harmon Fantasy Football. And remember to check out SundayDreamersClub.com for awesome fantasy football inspired t-shirts and sweatshirts. Again, that's SundayDreamersClub.com. This podcast is a proud member of the DAP Network. And now, here's my chat with Koopa on Get Real with Kacey Kasem. Here we are. All right. Koopa, we'll get into why Koopa in a minute. We'll get into all of that. Okay. But everybody out there listening to Get Real with Kacey Kasem right now, I have the one and the only Koopa with South Harmon with me tonight. Welcome to the show, Koopa.
Hey. How's it going?
I'm doing pretty well, and I'm excited to get to talk to you because I know the WoRP tool is probably something people are tuning in to find more about, and I'm just excited to get to know you. So thank you for coming on the show tonight. We're going to have a good one. It's going to be a good Monday.
Yeah. I'm always curious to hear what kinds of people come to listen to something that I'm involved in, just because you get all sorts of different kinds of people anytime you're making something new. Like sometimes you get people that are following you because they're like, oh, I know who you are from this other thing. You sometimes get people that are just like, hey, I heard somebody else talk about this thing, and it vaguely interested me, but I don't know anything about it. So it's really cool to see all those different kinds of people and all the interactions that you get from anybody else that is out there in the fantasy space, or sometimes not even in the fantasy space.
Yeah, for sure. And if you're listening to this podcast right now, let Koopa know that you're listening. Let him know why you're listening, and let him know what you learned, because we're going to learn a lot on this podcast tonight. So Koopa, first and foremost, let's just get into growing up. Were you a fan of sports, and what was your interaction with football like?
So growing up, I didn't start with football until I got about 10. Before that, I was actually mostly focused onto NASCAR and baseball. And it's funny, I got into those mostly because of video games. So I think it was NASCAR 2003 on the GameCube, and then I had on my Game Boy, I had this game called Baseball Advance, and it had all the rosters from like the 2002 season or something like that. And gosh, I must have played those games out forever and ever and ever. And to the point where like I could rattle off everybody in the game off the back of my hand. I know that the Baseball Advance game, I got so good at it, I could put it on the hardest difficulty and go 162-0, which is extremely hard, extremely impossible to do if it was real life. But eventually, I started to get into football. I grew up a little bit outside of Baltimore, and so the first team that I was really following was the Ravens. But I tend to be somebody that latches on to an individual rather than a team. And so I actually started latching on to Frank Gore at the time. And so I actually have behind me and unfortunately the audio listeners can't see it, but I've got a little painting that I did of Frank Gore. Um, and I followed him all through his Niners career, and so I call myself more of a Niners fan now, just because I like to associate him with the Niners, because after the Niners, he didn't really do much with anybody else. I know he had stints with other teams, but um, I, I'm definitely more of a Niners fan, and then the Ravens always hold a soft spot in my heart because of growing up right outside of Baltimore. The only NFL game that I've ever been to was a Ravens game, and growing up, you'd always watch the Ravens. That's who was on TV, and so I just I've kind of enjoyed that fandom from about that age, and growing into, okay, now I'm going to pay more attention to the league as a whole, and that kind of coincides with getting into fantasy, because I got into football at the age of 10, and then a year later my family did their first fantasy football league, and so that was my first introduction to it. And so I continued to not really stick with the teams and instead stick with the players. And so now all of a sudden, fantasy just encourages you to only stick with the players and not pay attention to the teams. And then I started watching Red Zone with my dad, and just we'd be sitting there watching the players solely for fantasy purposes. Like we'd have the picture in picture up, so that way we had the Ravens game on in the corner. And then otherwise it was full screen Red Zone, and that's what we were paying attention to. And like, oh yeah, we can watch the play for the Ravens in the corner, when like the play on Red Zone it wasn't going at that time. And sometimes you'd see the double where you'd see the play in the corner, the Ravens, and then you'd see it pop up on the Red Zone like 30 seconds later because of that delay that they have from the broadcasts.
Oh man, man, you're taking me down memory lane right here. So, okay, going back to like actually going to see an NFL game in person, do you remember that experience? Was there anything that stuck out from being able to go do that?
So I don't remember too much from it, to be honest, because I was much younger and I didn't really appreciate it as much at the time. I do remember it was back in the Kyle Bowler Ravens days. And so like I remember going to the stadium and being like, okay, who's the quarterback for the team again? Oh yeah, it's this Kyle Bowler guy. All right. I couldn't tell you. I mean, I can guarantee you Ray Lewis was on the team just because I know he was around during that time, but I don't know that I could have told you much beyond the team at that time. Um, the it kind of it went to that game kind of as an experience of like, oh, going to an NFL game, this will be a cool thing. Got to see it, and never it never really latched on to the whole like, oh, I need to be a part of the crowd. And I think part of that is just the result of, hey, I focus on the individual players. I'm not rooting for the team to do well. I'm rooting for the individuals that I want to root for. I have an interest in the running back, but not the quarterbacks and the wide receivers. So like, I'm not cheering when the quarterback throws the big play, the big pass play to the wide receiver or something like that. I'm just like, oh, that was a nice play. That was cool to see. Um, and so in a sense, like, I've now moved to Southwest Virginia. I have no NFL teams anywhere near me, and I don't miss the going to the stadium experience as a result. Is I much prefer to be at home. I'm able to have Red Zone up. I'm able to put up as many different game streams as I can get on various different monitors, and I'm able to just watch the games like from the comfort of my home, and I'm not feeling like I'm missing out on something.
So if I was a fly on the wall and I was watching what was going on a Sunday with you watching football, like how was that experience exactly? Describe what it's like to watch football with Koopa.
It depends on the time of the day, because so when the 1 o'clock games come on, you're going to see the TV that has Red Zone up, and then you're going to see one monitor to my right, and a laptop in front of me. The monitor like spun around from my desktop, and the and between those, there's going to be as many different streams as I can pull up. And so that will sometimes it'll be local broadcasts, sometimes it will be the out of market broadcasts. Whatever I have, I'm just going to pull every single one of those up and see as many different games of football at once where it's still visible and I can tell what's going on. When it gets to the afternoon games, especially once it gets around halftime, I'll go over into my kitchen to like start making dinner or whatever. And so I'll move the laptop up onto the bar that I have, and then I purposely got a swivel mount for my TV, so that way I can just swivel it all the way over and still see it from the kitchen while I'm like prepping food or whatever.
Wow. Sounds like you're super prepared. Like I got one TV and I'm happy if I get to even watch football on Sundays. It's crazy. But let's kind of talk more about that first fantasy football league that you were in. Exactly what's the story there? How did you get involved exactly? And what's the backstory of it all?
So my family was getting into football, and one of those things where you kind of need all your extended family to be involved, unless you have a really big family. And so my entire extended family got together, and I'm the oldest of my cousins. And so we finally had enough cousins who were old enough that we were like, okay, we can scrounge 8 people together in order to make a fantasy league. And so we did, and it was like an 8-person, if I had to take a guess, it was probably start 8, a league with me, my dad, my sister, a couple extended family members. And that first draft, the thing that I remember about it is that I drafted this young rookie running back by the name of Adrian Peterson in like the 6th round. And
That's a good one.
That helped drive me to a championship the very first year. And so ever since that point, I was into fantasy. And I am somebody that when I'm into something, I really get into it. And so all of a sudden now I am so into this thing. Every single week I'm like reading all the articles about waiver wire pickups, and I'm like trying to min max like my defenses week to week. And like after a couple of years, I started figuring out, oh, you can kind of predict which kickers are better. And so like I'm picking up and dropping kickers based off of matchups and all sorts of stuff like that. But I was always only involved in this one league all the way through like probably my sophomore year of high school. So like a good 6 or 7 years, I was only in this family league. And then I just started joining like random leagues on NFL.com, and you could just click, I want to join a league, and it would just put you in with like 11 other managers, and I'd join those. And you run into the problem that you run into anytime you have a free redraft league is people are there just to draft it and then they fade away.
Yep.
And so it was kind of fun in a sense of nobody else was playing the waivers except for maybe 1 or 2 other managers. So like you could feasibly win like a third of those leagues, like regardless of how your draft went.
Yeah.
But I was doing all those through high school, and so you finally get to like college, and I'm starting to do more leagues with people that are actually paying attention to football. You meet a bunch of other people there, and you're like, oh hey, everyone here knows what a fantasy league is, and we all watch football like in the dorm room on Sundays, so we can do all this together. And so that kind of hit the fix a little bit during college. And then COVID was a big year for when it all started to transition for me. So 2020 COVID, you're at home, you got nothing to do. I just start joining random leagues and just going and finding whatever I can, just joining it. And I probably was playing in like tens. I don't think I was at 100, but I was definitely in like the close to that number of just like number of leagues that I had just joined. And these were like across all sorts of different platforms. And then I was listening to fantasy content through that fall, which I'd never really done before. I'd never listened to podcasts. I always just read articles. And so then when the spring of 2021 hit, all the fantasy podcasts, what do? They turned to dynasty content. And I was like, what's this dynasty thing? It doesn't make any sense to me. And then and so I start searching for it, and I find the Reddit find a league page or whatever it is, and then find somebody that's like, hey, I want to try this dynasty thing, but I want somebody to do it with me. And I was like, sounds kind of fun. You do figure it out with somebody else. So I sign up with this guy to join a dynasty league. And 2021, I go through and play that with him. And what I realized over the course of that season was the two of us were so stuck in our ways. There was no way it was ever going to work. Like, he liked certain players and I liked other players. And so at the end of the season, I was like, you know what? You take the team. I'm going to go find my own stuff. And then that started 2022 and me really getting into Dynasty from that point.
That's a great little journey you had there. To be going from a family league to now being in all these dynasty leagues, and that's a whole new beast, and learning throughout the process. So when you were in college and you were playing fantasy football with these people that were like-minded, actually knew what fantasy football was, did you find yourself like doing a lot of research to try to one up these guys? Like how exactly did you make sure that like you were going to have the best draft, the best team, the best strategy going into everything?
So I was living by, and especially in redraft leagues, I still live by this philosophy that as long as you have waivers are almost more important than your draft. Mm-hmm. You can draft off of just about any ranking sheet, but what makes or breaks a championship is the guys that you pick up or don't pick up off of waivers over the course of the season. And so that's where I spent a ton of my time. It's just, okay, I was reading as many possible waiver wire articles as I could. That was when I first got introduced to fab bidding for waivers. And so figuring out, okay, how to best utilize that, how to make sure I'm not spending too much at the beginning of the year so I have enough to have a hammer at the end, but you still want to get the good guys after week one, like trying to find all that balance. And it was fun having a great group of people that were also all figuring out the same things. They're all relatively new to leagues that have a ton of active, involved people. And so of course you have the trash talking that goes on when you're seeing the fellow managers in your league every day, especially like if Friday, the day after the Thursday night game, that you're like, oh, haha, my guy just put up 30 points on you last night. Like, good luck beating me this week and things like that. But you also end up talking a lot of strategy with those people too. And it kind of became this podcast-like thing where you just have a bunch of rotating cast members and you're just always talking fantasy and figuring out like what sort of strategy you're talking about, the strategies that you're doing, and then they're talking about their counters to your strategy, and then you're coming up with your counter to their strategy, but you're telling it to each other's faces. And it was a ton of fun just to have so much time to dedicate to it, just in theory crafting and trying to go through and figure out, oh, this is how I want to try and beat these other people that I can see how they're playing and talk to them directly.
Yeah, I think people don't take into consideration their league mates as often as they should, like getting to know your league mates, how they draft, how they trade, how they do all that stuff. Yeah, it's definitely important. And being in college, like, I know you have a background in programming. Exactly, like, how did you decide that was the path you were going to go down?
So the programming thing was kind of interesting in terms of I was I was at the beginning of high school interested in technology. I've always been somebody that I was very advanced in math. I was drawn towards engineering as a field. I always liked that kind of stuff. And my sophomore year of high school, we had this robotics team. And I highly encourage anyone that has kids that are looking to get into STEM related fields. If your high school has a first robotics program, you encourage them to join that. And my team, it happened to be that there was one person that was programming it. And I was like, okay. And every other team had like 5 or 6 people. And I'm somebody, I don't like working in a large group. I like working with like a couple small
Yeah.
people. And so then I was like, sure, I'll join this programming guy and learn what he's doing. And at the time, he was a senior, so it was basically, hey, once he graduates, we don't have anybody to program this. I'm like, all right, I'll fill this hole. Um, and so I started learning how to program in terms of writing code for this robot. And anybody that has programmed, look up what it's like to program in National Instruments LabVIEW. If you When I say look up the image search of it, you'll understand what I mean when you look at it. It's doesn't look like code. And it's spaghetti and it's horrendous. I could talk so much about how bad that language is. But that's how I first learned to program. And then I've as throughout high school I started learning other languages and programming, and by the time I got to college I was like, all right, I want to do something with programming. So college, I get there, I'm looking at electrical engineering, computer science, and I I really start getting into what my job is now, which is actually I don't program normal computer programs. The stuff that I create for fantasy football are is like stuff that runs on websites. I actually hate the putting it on a website part. I like working with hardware. And so I work with all sorts of hardware programming, anything that's like an embedded processor. I work with those sorts of things. And fantasy football is kind of a way to stretch my skills in a different way. And so it's always kind of played into me as like this hobby sort of thing. And so it's like, oh, at work or when I was in college, I'm working with all these hardware systems, I'm programming those. And then when I want to take a break, I am not somebody that is like, oh, I'm going to go out to like a bar or something like that. That's just not really my style. And so what do I do instead? I'm like, well, I've got these skills. I know how to make programs and I know how to do all sorts of cool things with knowing the right topics to search for and how to make stuff. So I'm just going to make something that I wish existed. And so I go through and fantasy was the perfect avenue to be like, hey, I'm interested in fantasy football. There's a lot of data analysis, analytics, things like that I can do with it. And so let me just come up with something and just start making it. And if it turns into something that only I can use, it's something that only I can use. If it's something that other people can use, then great. And so there was definitely a few projects even before WoRP that were things that I came up with and created, and that will probably never see the light of day, just because they, for one reason or another, they would either not be usable by others or are not going to be very feasible to distribute or things like that.
Okay. I got it. I got it. So we had Mike on, or I say we, I did, and the listeners, we had Mike on, and he was, with South Harmon, by the way, and he was talking about the WoRP tool and how cool it is and all this stuff. But from a creator of a tool, I'd really like to hear how that came about, how you went to South Harmon with it, and what the idea process was coming up with what it is. People don't know what it is, so go ahead and let them know.
Yeah, um so the process of actually creating it came up, it was kind of a circuitous way to get there. So I was making these tools on my own. I tried first creating a values calculator that was entirely based off of trades. Like I think it's fantasycalc.com. They have one of those now. And it was about the time that they released their website that I was like starting to work on it, and gosh, I could not get the values to turn out right. Whatever magic they've done to make it so that way the values are actually correct based off of trades, hats off to them. And then I was working on this simulator, and that was actually the first thing that got me into talking with Mike and Adam, because that was just after I'd started getting into Dynasty. And so I remember January of 2022, I was like, I need to listen to some Dynasty focused content. So I look up what are some Dynasty content creators, find a Reddit post, and at the top of the list is, hey, there's this thing from Ray G called Destination Devi. And I was like, okay, let me pull that up. And I was doing this on a Saturday morning. Well, what the 40 Chess podcast always came out on Fridays. And so that was the most recent podcast. And so I just turned it on. And the funny thing was that was 40 Chess episode 1. And awesome. So that was the very first thing that I listened to. And, I was listening to that over the course of June through July. And I was like, at some point, I really like these guys. I've got to get on Patreon and support them. So I did that and joined their Patreon. And then a week later, they released an episode where Mike is talking about this strategy that he's doing where he's trading away a single good player for 3 really bad players, and how that strategy was actually a winning strategy for him. And I was like, I was listening to what he was talking about, and I was like, I can understand theoretically how this works, but I wonder if I can prove it. And at the time, I was working through a simulator, and this simulator, it was based on anybody that's interested, go look up the FF-verse project by Tan Ho. It's this really cool R-based repository of libraries and things like that, where you can do all sorts of fantasy football stuff. And you can pull all sorts of data, do all sorts of analytics on it. And he has a simulator built into it. And so I was building some extensions where I was able to put in a trade and see whether that trade made your team better or worse. And so I heard Mike do this episode where he listed like 15 different trades that he did. And he's like, all these trades I think are going to work out for me in the end. So I was like, you know what? Let me plug them all into this simulator with this trade calculator that I've made, and see what the results are. And plugged it in, let it run. And this is part of the reason you won't probably see this as an actual tool. It's because every time I did a trade, it took like 10 minutes to calculate the results of the simulations. And at the end of it, I was like, oh, you know what? Mike has... there's some validity to this argument. Like some of the trades that just like from a single trade, I was able to see, oh, you're going to win on average 1 additional game over the course of the season just by making this one trade. That sounds horrible. And it trades like trade Devonta Smith for a modern version would be like trade Devonta Smith for like Rashid Shaheed, Amari Cooper and Jawan Johnson or something, like something where it's like, okay, those 3 guys definitely don't match up to the guy that literally just got a 3-year $75 million contract. And so I go to Mike and Adam and say, hey, I've got this data. I thought it was pretty cool. And so they're like, yeah, this data is cool. Thanks for sharing it with us. Definitely let us know if you're doing other cool things. So get to August, and I'm listening to America's Game with Scott Connor and Eric Vanek, and they bring up this topic of something called WoRP, or wins over replacement player, and they're running off of this data that came out from Jordan McNamara from Analytics of Dynasty, and they're talking about the WoRP value of different players. And while they're going through the podcast, they're like, yeah, this data is for a 2 quarterback start 9 league or something like that. And I remember having seen this topic of WoRP come up from Adiko like 4 months prior, where he was like, yeah, I made this WoRP calculation thing. Here's the theory behind it, and here's my code on GitHub. And so I'm like, I wonder if I could use Adiko's stuff and make it and make some answers to some of these questions that Scott and Eric are posting. And so I go through, I run Adiko's code, and I'm like, I can make this. I can make this work, but I really want to do more with it. So I scrap all that code and just go back to the theory article. And I'm like, all right, how do I write this in a way that makes it so I can customize it to literally any league possible? And so I rewrite everything from scratch of, okay, let me pull the data, let me go through all the calculations, and let me get the output numbers, and go through, make all of that. And then I have it where I can script it up to run, where I just need somebody's league username and I type it into my computer and I hit run, and it saves a bunch of charts. And so I finally get that working maybe like October of 2022. And I tell the South Harmon Discord at that time, I'm in the top Savage tier. I'm like, hey, anybody that wants these charts for your league, like, this stuff's kind of interesting. Here's what mine look like. And I make that post, and Adam and Mike are like, hey, this is a really cool idea. We want to have you on like one of our AMAs to talk about it. And we can just go through, hey, what this data is and what it looks like comparing one league to another. And so we go on, and this is where I explain WoRP. WoRP is a calculation that allows you to compare one player to another, or more specifically, one position to another, in terms of the value they bring to your team. And WoRP stands for wins over replacement player. So it's homologated to how many wins your fantasy team is going to give you by having that player. So when we're talking, hey, Josh Allen has a value of 3 WoRP, the idea is, hey, if you needed to replace Josh Allen, because say Josh Allen gets injured, you're going to lose 3 wins over the course of the season by literally having to replace him with the next best person that's not on a team. And so that's the general idea. And what's cool is, depending on your different league sizes, your scoring settings, things like that, you're going to see different positions get different values put on them compared to your more standard league. When you think of your standard, like 12 teams start 10, it's going to look way different than when you have your 14 teams start 9 where you got 2 quarterbacks. Like, now those quarterbacks are worth a ton more than every other position. Or if you have your tight end, some people, I'm one of them, loves to play huge tight end premiums. And some of the tight end premiums don't even move the tight ends at all. Like, you're like, oh, if you give an extra half point to every tight end reception, like, that's going to be a big difference to that position. And I look at the charts and I'm like, doesn't make that much of a difference. So I go on to this AMA and I talk about all these concepts, and I'm showing my different leagues and showing some of the ones that Adam and Mike are in. And then I open it up and say, hey, if you send me your username and you're in the Discord, I'm just going to update a Google Drive a box that I have and just post all the charts every single week. And so I'm posting it in there every single week over the course of the rest of that season. And I think there were 1 or 2 people that were actually consistently looking at it. But most everyone else was like kind of forgot about it. They were like, oh yeah, there was this thing, I looked at it once, it kind of seemed cool, but I didn't really know what to do with it. And so um but at that point I'm like all into this. I'm like, I really like this tool. I think that there's a lot of potential here, but I need to do something about it. And that's where I discover that there's this cool package called R Shiny that basically you take your code and you just hook it up to this package and it makes a web page out of it for you. And I'm like, that is exactly what I need. And so I go through, I punch it all into this R Shiny thing, figure out how to host it on like on my computer on my home network, and I go to Mike and Adam and I say, "Hey, look, this WoRP tool, I can make it hosted on a website. Do you want to help me get it out there?" And I send them the link to my home network of just like it's like if you've ever looked at like an IP address where you have like two numbers, a dot, two numbers, a dot, two numbers, a dot, and then two more numbers, like that's what I was giving them. That was the website link. And they were like, "Oh, this thing is cool." And Adam was like, "I'll help. Why don't we work together and figure out how to get this on a website?" And this goes back to what I mentioned a while ago. I do not like making websites. I hate I hate the building the user interface part. And so I'm like, all right, you know what? We're going to Squarespace this thing. Like I've at that point I had used Squarespace once, but it was one of those things where if you were watching YouTube videos, if you were listening to podcasts from like 2018 through 2023, like almost every other one at some point had a Squarespace referral code and all those sorts of things. And so, I grab one that I'm listening to at the time. I'm like, all right, here's a code. Let's punch it in. Adam, let's just make this website and we'll link up the WoRP tool to it. And from like a month after talking to Adam and Mike, we're launching the South Harmon website. And it has a place for the South Harmon team, like a spot for articles, a spot for to have like a South Harmon store where they can start selling merchandise on it, and then we also have the subscription for the WoRP tool involved in it. And so that's when I first launched the tool, and that's when it really starts to kick off of, okay, I'm talking about this concept on the 40 Chess podcast. I'm starting it on AMA. Scott Connor picks it up and starts talking about it a bunch, and that started driving a bunch of interest into it, and it kind of just started taking off from that point.
That's really cool, because a lot of people are content creators, but not a lot of people are like the guys behind the tools, like it's a whole different world, and getting to learn about that from you is really interesting to see. When you started out, I know, joining different podcasts, being promoted by different people and all of that were ways to spread the word, but were there any other ways, maybe for people that are listening that have stuff out there that they're trying to get other eyes on? Like, how would you go about getting more eyes on things?
The biggest thing that I would do is get your tool in front of people and really and give them the how to use it. The thing about WoRP especially is that it's actually kind of hard to understand the first time you're looking at it. You look at this pretty chart and you're like, okay, but what does this pretty chart mean? And so one of the ways that actually helped a ton with me helping describe this thing to people was attending the expo and having a booth. So we had a booth at the expo last year where we were showing the WoRP tool, and I was there at the booth with my laptop, and my laptop is awesome in that it has a screen that fully swivels 180, so I can just show it to them while I am typing on the keyboard, and I'm showing them, okay, this is what this league looks like, and I'm pulling up I'm telling them, give me your sleeper username and I'm going to show you how this thing works. And so I pull up one of their leagues and I show them what it looks like. And I'm like, okay, now what's your league with the craziest settings? And they give me that one. And then I pull up that one. I'm like, you see how this thing is different? This is how you start to understand, okay, this league, look how this line is now higher than this other one. Look how the tight end line is higher than the wide receivers, or look how the quarterback is lower than both the running backs and the wide receivers. Like, now you can, and a lot of these people, you have a notion of, yeah, this is the most valuable position in my league. But when you start to see it displayed in colors on the graph of like, yeah, I know this league, the guy that wins is always the one that has the best two quarterbacks. And you look at the graph and it's the quarterback graph is higher than every other position. You're like, oh, duh. It's because the data supports the fact that the team with the best chance to win has the best quarterbacks on their team. And so you start to see that come out in the data, and it helps confirm a lot of things that you already knew. And then you get into leagues where the settings are all over the place. South Harmon, that's almost all the South Harmon leagues where we're going to start way more people than should normally be started. Like we'll start like 12, 14. I'm going to start 16. And you're going to turn on just about every setting you possibly can. If it exists, you're going to put a number next to it. Are we going to give points for first down? Yes. Are we going to give bonuses to wide receivers and tight ends just for catching passes? Yes. Are we going to give points for getting a reception between a certain yardage range? Yes. Like, we're just going to turn every single thing on. And then it becomes impossible for you to be like, I don't know what is going on in this league. Like, I can tell that all the positions are getting way more points, but which position is actually the most valuable? And you plug it into the WoRP tool, and once you're used to it, you pull up the data and you instantly know, oh, this is what's most valuable in this league. And so that happens to me at the beginning of 2023, where I had this data and we started a league where it was, I ran it through the WoRP tool, and running back was this line that was like way higher than everything else. And at that time it was the, hey, running backs are not worth it for dynasty. We're going to play 1 year windows with all these guys. And so nobody was drafting running backs. And so I start off this dynasty startup draft in January of 2023. My first 9 picks, 8 of them were running backs. And everyone's like, Koopa, you've got something going. I don't know whether it's going to work out for you, but good luck to you, because you're the only one doing your thing. And sure enough, come the end of December, I won that league. It's just I went through and I just nailed the settings for it.
That's awesome.
And it's because I had the familiarity with it. And I'd put in the work to learn it. But it's one of those things where it's not going to give you an end-all be-all number. Like, it's designed to be used in conjunction with your own rankings, your own player biases. I do the same thing. I am making my content designed around, hey, this is my general strategy. But then in that strategy is also, hey, I personally like one player over another. I personally am a little bit more down on, say, Jordan Addison than the market is. So I'm not going to have as much Jordan Addison. But the kind of player that most people associate Jordan Addison to be, like, okay, I in terms of the dynasty market, he's not that different right now than, say, like a JSN. And so my strategy says you want a player like Jordan Addison or JSN, but I'm not telling you which guy to choose. And that's the beauty of how the WoRP tool works, is it doesn't tell you want the specific player. I give, when you look at the individual year data, it gives you the player names just so you can have some mental context around who the guys are. But recently I launched multi-year WoRP, and it doesn't have player names. It's just quarterback 1 is this, quarterback 2 is this. And so you're able to just overlay your own rankings onto it. Just, okay, I know my quarterback one is Josh Allen, and my number two is Patrick Mahomes, and my number three is Jalen Hurts. But if that's different for somebody else, that's great, because all those guys are the same kind of quarterback. They're all going to score a ton of points.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter who you choose, as long as if the tool is saying you want to have a top three quarterback, you're getting a top three quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, I just started looking at the WoRP tool. Like, I will admit, I was one of those people that looked at it at first and was like, okay, I don't really get this. I had to actually go do my research to kind of figure out what I was doing. So I sat down and looked at one of my leagues, and I was just so shocked. I was like, wow, it's like Christian McCaffrey is one, and then a big drop to the next running back. And I'm like, man, I would have never thought. So I'm like, okay, this is really interesting stuff. So to get involved in that and actually start looking at it, this if you're one of the people like me who's like, I don't know, go look at it, because it's really a great tool for your league, for sure, for sure. Also though, do you ever get feedback from people and kind of integrate that into what you're doing as well?
Yes, I've definitely gotten feedback. So some of the settings that you see on the sidebar that I give access to for, like, hey, I want to, um, it, I want to. The weak slider initially was there, but I think it's just about everything below that was initially not. Um, and and so I just add in, like, somebody's like, hey, I've always curious if I were to change this thing. And so when I first came out with what I call a WoRP, or adjusted WoRP, that's adjusted based off of start sit rates. Um, when I was first creating it, I was showing it to some people, and they were like, hey, I want to be able to adjust this based on how efficiently everybody is started in my league. Like, I don't adjusted WoRP, it adjusts based on what players are the most started. So that way, if players don't get penalized if they aren't started a lot. When I was creating it, I was looking back on the 2022 season, and the main player that I was focused on this fixing was the value of Alexander Madison. So Alexander Madison in 2022, you didn't start him any week the whole season except for the two that Dalvin Cook missed. And those 2 weeks he absolutely smashed. He got like he had like over 20 carries for over 100 yards, a couple touchdowns each week. Like, it was a huge impact. But the problem was, the way the WoRP tool initially worked was Alexander Madison was getting negative WoRP for every other week. So when you looked at him over the course of the season, his value was negative. And it's like, no, he was a positive player to your team, because the 2 weeks that you needed him and you actually put him in your lineup, he won you your week. And so a WoRP, or adjusted WoRP, is using the start sit data. So those weeks that, hey, Alexander Madison wasn't in my lineup, he's not hurt. He's not getting hurt by that. His value just stays a constant 0. And then those 2 weeks that he smashed, he'd get the positive values from those. And then also the guys that hurt your team. So if you started somebody who did really poor for you, and maybe Alexander Madison in 2023 when he didn't do as well. If you were starting him when you started him and he went out there and he only got you 30 yards and didn't get a touchdown, like, okay, that was actually a negative hurt to your team, so we're going to count that. And then when you benched him and then the following week he got 60 yards and a touchdown, well, you don't get the positive value for that. And so that's what adjusted WoRP is working through, is, okay, how often would these guys get started? And I chose an arbitrary value for, okay, how efficient it is everybody in the league, and they were like, hey, I want to be able to make it so that way I can include more players or exclude more players, just to see how that affects the data. And so that's where it ended up coming with, there's a drop down now where you can choose perfect, high, medium, and low for the efficiency. And that selector is just perfect is, I'm only going to include, like, if you have a super flex league, it's only going to include the top 24 quarterbacks. It's only going to include the top 24 running backs plus however many running backs would have fit into the flex spots. It's only going to include the 24 wide receivers and however many wide receivers are in the flex spots. But if you turn it to high, now it's going to add in another 20%. You go to medium, another 50. You go low, it's going to double the number for every single one. And so you're able to include or exclude more people based on how efficient your league is. Like, maybe if some of the managers are extremely highly if a lot of the players are consolidated into a few teams, you might want to lean more towards that perfect uh, value, because you're needing to the players that are going onto your team, you need to match up with these absolutely monster teams. But when you start getting to where, hey, things are a little bit more spread out, like maybe there is one good team, but the other teams are, they all have the same amount of value, you might be able to go a little bit towards the medium or the low, because the kinds of guys that are going to get started and actually still have an impact are the guys that, hey, they might not be the ones that you're expecting to be there every single week. Like the teams that you're competing against are going to have these lower value guys, are going to play a little more inefficiently because their team isn't horrible, but they're still trying to compete.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have some of these sliders to play with, and so you've had some stuff like that I've gotten feedback from, and especially with some of the new stuff of the multi-year WoRP. I'd been requested for that, and as I was going through trying to make rookie WoRP, I realized, oh, you know what? I'm going to basically need to make multi-year WoRP while I'm making rookie WoRP. So you know what? Let me just go through and tack that on, and here we go. Let's just launch that. And that's, anyone that was paying attention to the development, that's why those two things happened like a week apart from each other. I made multi-year WoRP, launched it, and then 2 days later had rookie WoRP and sat on it for 5 days just so I didn't launch two massive updates back to back to each other.
Smart thinking. But that's awesome. That is awesome. Yeah, I was going to ask you about rookies and everything, because I know with the draft is upcoming, and this will probably release after the draft, but with the upcoming draft, like, do you watch the draft? How do you look at the draft, and also look at like the WoRP tool and how they can kind of be together?
So so in terms of watching the draft, I mean, I'm going to be on the South Harmon live stream. I guess if this is coming out after the draft, you missed it, but we're going to have go rewatch it with like tons of giveaways, and we're going to be streaming every single minute of the draft. But looking at the players, I realized from the WoRP tool just how hard it is to hit on the value from the draft. Even the best rookies don't have an impact on your team really much at all in terms of helping you win a championship. The value they have is that they're young, and the fact that everybody wants the young guy who they think is going to grow into somebody new. And it's also extremely hard to hit the right people. The way the rookie WoRP in my tool works is it doesn't go based on, hey, this was the player picked at the 101, this is the player picked at the 102, etc. It goes based on who was the best rookie in the class. And oftentimes the best rookie in the class isn't the guy picked at 101. The guy at 101 is the guy we think is most likely to be the best rookie in the class. But sometimes it's, hey, this is the guy who, if you just pick him, you aren't going to get royally screwed. He's still going to be one of the top 5 rookies in this class. And the difference between the number 1 rookie and the number 5 rookie is staggering. Just it is such a huge difference in terms of the impact to your team. And so it really showed when I'm going through Rookie WoRP just how important it is to be drafting for value and not drafting for need. Because the need isn't going to be there for you. When you're going through your rookie draft, if you're there going, hey, I'm trying to decide between this quarterback or wide receiver, don't look at, hey, I need this wide receiver on my team because my team is a little bit light on wide receivers. You only want to look at who's more likely to increase or hold their value. And we've kind of found over history, the quarterbacks are much more likely to do that because everybody needs a quarterback. Even when, as long as it's like a first round NFL draft quarterback, they're going to have a chance in year 2. And they aren't going to lose much value going into that year 2. And even if they have a bad year 1, because you're going to chalk it up to, oh, it was their rookie year. They'll figure it out next year. And that does happen with some quarterbacks. But the cool thing is that if you draft that quarterback, you have the value now. And so then when you get to the point of maybe later in the season, you are competing. Now you're able to trade that quarterback for something that makes a difference to your team and helps you out and wins you a championship. But we always attribute it to, hey, I traded this quarterback for this player, and that player helped me win a championship, so that was a good trade. But it starts from all the way back in my rookie draft. I chose to draft this quarterback over this wide receiver because that was the right move then that allowed me this opportunity later on to be able to make this move. Whereas we see the wide receivers and the running backs and especially the tight ends, they have to produce. If they don't produce, their value absolutely tanks. Just look at what we're looking at with Quentin Johnson a year later. Like he's had 1 season in the NFL, and what happened? He did almost nothing. Right at the end of the season, he got some more playing time and like was starting to catch a little bit of passes. But quarterbacks, they can sit out the full first year and still retain all of their value. I mean, just look at Jordan Love, who sat behind Aaron Rodgers for 3 years. And as soon as we were like, hey, Aaron Rodgers is on his way out, Jordan Love is going to play, there was a ton of value in Jordan Love just simply because he was a starting quarterback that we didn't know anything about. And so that's what as WoRP has really opened my eyes to, is the fact just how important it is with your rookies to be focused on the value retention. And so if you are able to load up on a class, and so this is actually, it confirms some of my strategies of, I want to try and get as many draft picks in a single draft class. Now you're way more likely to hit those top tier guys rather than taking a single dart throw. And so if you're able to say in this year's class, let's say you can get yourself 4 of the top 7 picks. Well, now you have the flexibility where if you want to, you can be like, hey, I'm just going to get myself all 3 of Marvin Harrison Jr., Rome Odunze, and Malik Neighbors. And one of those guys is probably going to be the best wide receiver in the class. And the difference between that guy and the other 2 is going to be massive. But the thing is, if you only take a shot at one, you might guess wrong. And now you're going to be stuck having invested this one thing into a guy that isn't making a huge difference on your team. But you took it, it's like playing the lottery. You got this ticket and it just didn't get you everything you wanted. You wanted the big grand prize, and all you got back was, oh yeah, I got the $5 I spent on this lottery ticket back. And so what you want to do is try and get all of them, and then it's like if you have all the lottery ticket numbers, you're guaranteed to win. And so it's kind of confirmed that of you need to win to take advantage of a rookie pick. If you and as much as you want to think it of, I know how to figure out who the best rookie is, I watch a ton of film, I do all the data analysis, nobody can do it perfectly.
Mm-mm.
There are people that can do it better than average, sure. But really a lot of people fall into thinking they're better than average when really they are average.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the things of you go out and you survey people, do you think you're better than the average driver? And like 80% of people will say, yes, I'm a better driver than the average driver. I can tell you right now, statistics say only 50% of people are better than the average driver. And so,
yes. Okay.
and so, so at least 30% of those people are wrong. It might even be more, because some people that think they're worse than the average driver are probably better than the average. You start going through all the theory crafting of how all this works, and it's like, yeah, people think they are better than they are. And so my strategy plays into that of I am going to accept the fact that I am not better than the average person in terms of my ability to choose one thing over another. So instead, I'm going to play this grand strategy that takes away all of that and it actually embraces the variance. And instead says, okay, what you want to do is go through, just accumulate as many draft picks as you can, take all the shots, and then you're guaranteed to hit at least some of them. And then everything that doesn't hit, you get rid of and you reload or whatever. But you want to embrace that variance and not be aiming for an individual result.
You're giving me a lot to think about. Like, I love this conversation, but I'm also like, man, I can't wait for it to be over so I can go get on the WoRP tool and start looking at my leagues, because I really hate being just in the middle. And I feel like 2 of the 3 that I'm in, I'm just like right there in the middle. So I need to go look and actually see what's going on in these leagues. So let's talk about your name, because you go by Koopa. All right.
Yep.
We got Koopa here. And, Koopatroopa8, you guys go follow him. We'll talk about that. But how come, or why are you Koopa? How about that? Why do you go by Koopa?
So part of it stems from my online presence has always been under a pseudonym. And some of that is my background is cybersecurity. I have always been cybersecurity people are always these privacy nuts, and I'm not as much of a privacy nut as other people, but it does mean that I do stuff under, I always have start under a pseudonym. And there's a couple places online, I'm sure if you look and you dig hard enough, you can figure out what my real name is. But when I was getting into fantasy stuff, everything blew up under Koopa.
Yeah.
And so it got to the point where, okay, you know what? I'm going to stick with it.
Yeah.
And the Koopa thing just came from everyone's got a spirit animal. And my spirit animal is a turtle. And I'm pointing behind me right now for the audio listeners. I've got shelves of just tons of turtles. Anytime I travel to a place, I get a handcrafted turtle from the place that I travel to. And then I put it on a shelf. And so I've got like probably 30 to 40 of these little handcrafted turtles that I've gotten from anywhere that I've traveled to. And so when I was making online pseudonym, it was okay, I want to do something turtle related, and I'm like, well, gaming wise, like anytime I'm playing like Mario Kart, or I played a ton of like Mario Strikers and Mario Baseball, I was always choosing the Koopa. And I was like, it'd be funny to be a Koopa. And that was maybe when I was 12, 13, somewhere in there. And then it's just stuck ever since. And then 8 has always been a number that has shown up a lot in my life. I mentioned at the beginning of this show how I watched NASCAR when I was young. Well, who did I first watch? Dale Jr. And he was number 8. And when I joined my robotics team, we were 888, and um and then just 8 has shown up with I think it was my I played football for 1 year in middle school, and my number was like 48 or something like that, and it just like the 8 just kept showing up and everything,
Following you.
and and so I was like, you know what, stick the 8 on the end, and so that's why I go by Koopatroopa8. The only reason my Twitter handle is at Dynasty Koopa is because whoever has Koopatroopa8 has it, and they have never posted a tweet since their account was made 11 years ago. And I check the account once every 6 months to see whether it's deleted yet, and it never has been. And I wish I could. I have sent them a message. Hey, do you still use this account? I'd love to
Right.
have the username, and never gotten anything back. So it's just one of those. All right. Well, I guess I'm gonna always be Dynasty Koopa on Twitter, because I'm probably never getting that I get unless I get large enough I can somehow meet Elon Musk and get him to delete that account for me and let me take the username.
There you go. Just be like, look, I'll help you out with your dynasty team. You let me have this handle. Everything's good. Everything's good.
Yeah.
So you brought up the expo, which is something that I do talk about a lot on this podcast. Again, it is such an awesome place to go. It's so cool to experience so many fantasy football lovers. Like it's mind-blowing. But you brought up having a booth and being able to explain WoRP and everything else. So what was having a booth like? What was your experience like at the expo in general?
The expo. So my first time going to the expo was in fact last year when I had the booth. And what was I got so much more out of the expo from the first 2 days as a result. The party Friday night, all the stuff going on Saturday, because that was when I got to meet the most people from a, hey, I go seek them out sort of thing.
Mhm.
And I have the time to do these longer conversations. It's almost to the point where I would almost encourage people that if you are going to the expo for the first time, just don't have a booth for yourself. If it's your first time there, just go in and enjoy it.
Mhm.
Because Sunday, the big day with all the booths, I think I probably spent 30 minutes walking around and like seeing the other booths and like listening to a panel for 5 minutes or something like that. But I didn't get a chance to fully enjoy that Sunday, because what was cool was, hey, I was able to have the booth. I was able to meet a ton of cool people, talk about the WoRP tool, show them, hey, this is how this thing works. And met all sorts of great people, all sorts of awesome content creators there. But in some ways I missed out on the true fan goer experience, in a sense of, hey, this is now an event with all my people. Like the talking fantasy football, like I don't have anybody in my immediate area that really is into fantasy football.
Yep.
Never mind is into it the amount that I am. And so finally being in a place where like, oh, I can have a conversation about fantasy football, like in face with another human being and it doesn't fizzle out after 30 seconds is like mind blowing. And you have all these other people to talk to. And in my case, I'd built online relationships with a ton of these other people. It's funny, one of my first dynasty leagues, I ended up joining with some creators from the JWB fantasy football group. And when I joined the league, I had no idea who they were. I was just filling an orphan. And I met the guys through that league, and I'd finally figured out, like after being in this league for almost a year, like, oh wait, these guys actually make content. Like, oh, let me start paying attention to that. And got to meet all of them at the expo. I got to meet a ton of other people that I listened to. I listened to like a lot of the Campus to Canton guys and got to meet all of them there. And it was my first time meeting anybody from South Harmon.
Yeah.
Was going to that expo, and it's just cool to have that experience of, hey, all these content creators that I've paid attention to somewhat over the course of many years, all these other people that are involved in the community, who, whether they listen to a bunch of content, whether they might write some articles, whether they're just like, hey, I just hang out in some discords from time to time, like you get to meet all of these people, and it's really cool to interact with everyone who's like, yeah, I share that same interest. And like when you're getting into where you can discern between different people of like, oh, this person plays in a lot of redraft leagues, this person plays in a lot of dynasty leagues, oh, this person really likes the keeper format, like this person likes IDP. And you can talk about this stuff where, like, if you said any of those words to anybody in like around your hometown who doesn't know much about fantasy football, they're like, what did you just say to me? What you said
Right?
makes zero sense. And it's being able to be a part of that world that is just the coolest part about the expo, and just having everybody there involved, and just loving the same things that you do.
Yeah, it's such a blast, and I'm gonna have a booth there this year, but I have family that I'm gonna have do all the working for me, so I'll
I've
be
heard your
there,
plan, and
but
it is beautiful. That is
it's gonna be great.
100% the way that you want to do a booth. You
Yeah,
have a booth and you aren't stuck there.
right.
Because running the booth, like I was running it more or less for South Harmon. Adam and Mike got to go off and do stuff, but the main thing we were pushing was the WoRP tool. And it's like, well,
Mhm.
I'm the best person to be there to
Yep,
talk about it.
sure
And
are.
it's like, and so guess what? Now I'm stuck at the booth, like enjoying all of it. And it's like that first time is like, I almost wish I could have had that experience just to like just to have an extra couple hours just to go through everything. And it's like with any conference, there's going to be way more than you could possibly want to do.
Mhm.
And so even if you don't have any other obligations, you're going to go there, and you're going to be like, hey, I need to pick and choose. I want to go to this talk, but I also want to go to this talk. I also want to have time to go and look at all the other things that are just constantly going on. And so and so I'm I'm already in my head planning out, okay, for 2024 when I'm going to the expo, I'm not going to be stuck at the booth the whole time. Like
Yeah.
I'm going to make sure that I have time to go out, that I can go check out some of the other booths, and like actually spend time like seeing what other people have to offer. And like I knew a couple other people that had booths, and so like I took a quick 5-minute detour to go check out their booth and say hi and whatnot. But it's just one of those things, I'd love to be able to have spent more time checking out everyone that I didn't know, and just
Right.
finding out, hey, who are these guys? What do they do? Like, and like right next to us, I got to talk to them a little bit. They were a group doing, I can't even remember the name now, but it was fantasy leagues. I think it was Powers Fantasy League or something like that. But it's just like you've got people doing cool stuff where you run a fantasy league where every manager has their own unique power that they can choose to activate at different points in the season, that like can force you to bench somebody else has to bench their star player, or your team's allowed to substitute in one person after the week is done, or things like that. And um I'm sure there's so many other creators there that are doing all sorts of cool things that I would have loved to have seen. And it's just, and that's the kind of stuff that it's like, I know that is all there, and I came so close to seeing that part of it, and it's like, oh man, how did I miss out on that?
Well, it's okay because every year I feel like I learn more and I kind of figure out how to work this and how to work that and where to go and all this other stuff. Are you going to be in attendance this year?
Yeah, I've already gotten my ticket for it, and I know South Harmon we're doing the last year we had a school that we rented out for all of us, and I know we're doing the same thing this year, and so I know I'll be staying there, and we'll be I know for us South Harmon people, we are getting together a couple days before and just having it, like being able to enjoy a couple days with ourselves before we get into the full expo, and it kind of is stretching out to like almost a full week at this point. And so that's gonna I already have planned for like I told work I'm like, I'm just from this date to this date, I'm just not I don't plan on me being in the office because I'm not going to be. And so I'm just already planning to be at the expo for that.
That's a great plan. And yeah, I feel like more and more people are going extra days early just to get there and kind of hang out with people because, yeah, so much jam packed into the weekend. You don't have time to see it all and to meet everybody. And you feel real bad when you leave and you're like, man, I didn't get to meet this person and I know they were there. And yeah, and luckily they put the videos of the different panels up on YouTube, but it's like, being there and actually getting to like listen to it and ask questions and all that, it is a different sort of feeling. So definitely. What do you like to do when you have free time? Fantasy football, I know, is a big part of your life, but are there other things that you have as hobbies or things that you like to do when you're not doing fantasy football related stuff?
So fantasy football helps drive some of the other hobbies that I have and like gives them purpose. So like one of them is that like I've built myself a whole home server sort of thing. And that home server, it's like, sure, you can build a computer and like be like, oh, I'm going to put, I'm going to run it as a router. Like, great, cool. So now I've just spent way more money than going and getting a router from Best Buy and plugging it into my network. Like, what was the point of that? But so like for fantasy football, like my new podcast that I just launched, Grinding the Edge, um, as part of that, I'm going to be using a ton of data that I have accumulated about fantasy football leagues.
Hmm.
And what I've what I have done is I've turned that server into my storage server. So I think I'm up to 1.7 terabytes of data just about fantasy football leagues and what people do in them and how they play them, all that kind of stuff. And so giving the purpose of, okay, how do I collect all this data? How do I store it? How do I efficiently retrieve the data that I want to retrieve from it? And like learning all those sorts of things has been something that's like I want to have a purpose of something to do, and fantasy football gives this purpose of, oh, now I need to spend my free time learning how databases work. I need to learn how to use Python to read my database, get the data out and turn it into a graph, because I can more easily interpret a graph than I can a line of a million numbers, and things like that where I'm learning how to do stuff with the intention of, yeah, eventually this might become useful in fantasy football. It might not, but I can keep up with technology. I can I'm somebody, if you can start naming computer parts and I know exactly what you're talking about. I've all the computers in my house are ones that I have built. And so but my motivation that helps give it purpose is, hey, I'm going to be using this on fantasy at some point. Like I have this end goal, and yeah, it might take me 6 months to get there. I started this fantasy football data collection journey that I've been on in October of last year. And even before that, I knew I wanted to do it. And it took me about 2 months to go through, find all the parts that I needed for my new server, figure out, okay, exactly how much space do I think this is going to need? What kind of hardware am I going to need to make sure that it's going to be powerful enough for the amount of data I'm pumping into this thing, and all those sorts of things. And so it helped give that purpose that at the end of it, like, okay, yeah, I know this hobby that I'm working on, like, isn't just going to be I spend $1,000 build a new computer and then like I've got nothing now. It's like, okay, I built $1,000 computer, and I've got, what am I going to do with it? I just spent $1,000 and it's going to sit here. Like, I don't want to do that because then it just feels like a waste of money.
Right. So bringing up your podcast, though, I don't want to leave without touching on that, because having a podcast is something I'm sure there are people out there that wish they had podcasts that just haven't done it yet. And then there's people like us who have podcasts. But what has your experience been like podcasting? Did you do it before you started a podcast, or was it your first experience? How did that go with you?
So it is my first time doing a podcast. I've always been somebody that I am okay like going up in front of a room and giving a presentation. Like that has never fazed me. I'm not somebody that's usually going to seek that out, but
Mhm.
I'll do it if needed. And and so the podcast kind of came as a result of a very long pull of like I need to find some way to get my voice out there more easily than me answering the same thing over and over in Discord. And so it, I actually first was asked by Adam, "Hey, Koopa, do you want to do a podcast?" when I first showed up to the expo in August of last year. And it took all the way until April for me to be like, "Yes, I'm ready for it." Um and even before Adam had asked me, I'd been thinking about, hey, would I want to do a podcast? Like, what would I have to talk about? Like, and I wasn't fully refined at that point. And so it took a long time for it to come to fruition of, hey, I know what I'm going to do, because I didn't want to feel like I was rehashing things that other people were talking about, because that's that's something that it just doesn't interest me. If I'm talking about something that somebody else is talking about, I feel like they're going to be talking about it better than I am. Like I'm not going to sit here, I'm not going to grind all the film. I'm not going to go over 20 times what every single player's statistics are and tease out the, hey, this is the guy that's the sleeper, the one you should be watching out for. That's just not me. That's not my strategy. And so it took me all that time to figure out, okay, what do I want to cover? And I realized where the hole was talking about fantasy football from the data of fantasy football. People talk about their experiences in their leagues, and they're like, hey, in my league, this is what happened. This is what I have noticed this trend because I'm in 50 leagues, and I'm noticing the other managers are doing these things. But I want to go through and give the data of, well, out of 50 leagues, 40% of them, they're getting rid of this player. And in 30% of them, they're leaving this value on the table by having this other player still available on waivers. And all those sorts of things where I can point to the data, and it's not biased by, hey, if you become a big enough content creator, you start making your own leagues with your viewers, and then all your viewers are doing the same things that you are, and so then you might become biased by the things that your viewers are smarter than the average fantasy player. And so now all of a sudden your content is assuming the players are smarter than they actually are. And so I want to be giving content that is based on the actual actions of people that don't listen to me. When I look at the fantasy football data, everyone's a data point. I just kind of assume that none of the data I'm looking at is people that know who I am. And so it's this really cool aspect of I'm able to talk about fantasy and about fantasy leagues that I'm not in, that I'm not a part of. And so that's where that whole data collection thing I was talking about, where I have 1.7 terabytes of data, that's where that's coming up. Is I'm okay, let me pull all this data. Episode 1 was just me going through what is the most popular types of dynasty leagues. I found that that it's like 40% of dynasty leagues or something like that are 10-team dynasty. I'm not in a single 10-team dynasty league. And so if I were to talk about my experience in Dynasty, I'm now leaving 40% of all leagues on the table. And but I can talk about the data of what happens. I can talk about, hey, this is I'm going to be doing some episodes on what winning teams look like. Just I'm not going to be looking at it from the lens of a WoRP tool or the lens of like any other, hey, this is the player that had the most points per game. I'm just going to be looking at it straight from this is what a winning team had on its roster. And that's what I find to be really unique about what I'm creating is how can I go through and analyze fantasy purely from a fantasy focused data analysis point of view. And I found, hey, there's nothing that really focuses on this lane, and I knew enough of how to do it. And so I was like, that's what my podcast is going to be about. And we'll see how long it goes on. We'll see how long that data is good before it starts rehashing too much and that kind of stuff. But I would like to think that I have enough for it to go on for quite a while. So.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like it. That is so awesome. I'm so happy for you having this new podcast and everything. That's so awesome. Like, and being over with South Harmon now, I'm just excited.
I would love to give the advice to somebody that's also starting a new podcast, especially because this one is a solo pod too. Just it is going to be much harder to start a solo pod. Not having somebody to bounce off of was something very hard to get used to, of just talking so long without a break, talking about the same topic, trying to keep yourself on track, and not having anybody that is listening on the other end. So you're listening to your own voice, trying to make sure you didn't trip up and say something wrong. And what helped a ton was just record a bunch of episodes myself. Like I sent a test episode to Adam and Mike and Fizzle and told them, hey, listen to this and give me some feedback. And that one ended up being just what aired episode 1. But I recorded 4 different versions of that before then, where I would read a sentence and then I would stop and it'd be like, I didn't like how that sounded. I inflected this word wrong, and delete it and redo it and delete it. Like, I think the first one that I did, I recorded a 25-minute podcast over the course of about 2 hours and 15 minutes. and that was just absolutely brutal. And I eventually got to the point where I was like, you know what? I know how to talk. I just need to get out of my own head, and I just need to do it. I just need to record it and be happy with how it came out and understand that it's not going to be perfect. Nobody talks perfect their first time. Nobody is able to make the perfect product that's exactly how they envision it in their head. And I'm just going to make it and put it out there, and I'll get better as time goes on. But I'll still be proud of that first episode that comes out. Even though I know it's going to be an episode that, I will have learned way more in a year from now. I probably will have been able to do it way better. And maybe I will come back and revisit the topic and redo it. But that first episode, knowing where I was and what I was coming from, that was a huge milestone, and I'm still going to be proud of it.
I have to give you huge props, because doing a solo podcast, I can't even imagine. I have enough trouble doing the intro for this. Like, I will record it like over and over. And that's like my least favorite part of the editing process, is trying to, because I listen to it back. I'm like, I don't talk like that, but whatever. Now I can have to get over it, so that's what I try to do too. But so far it hasn't worked out too well for me, but maybe I'll have to get some tips from you, because
something that has really helped me for going back through the editing process is to listen to my own podcast back at double speed.
Oh yeah.
So I listen to podcasts in normal at double speed. If you tell me to listen to something, I'm listening to it at double speed, trim silence. Any podcast is too slow for me at this point. But when I'm listening to myself back, if I listen to myself back at normal speed, I hate the sound of my own voice, because the way I hear it in my own head is so different than the way it sounds recorded into a microphone. But if I listen to it at double speed, it doesn't sound like my own voice. And so then I can get over that hump and actually pay attention to what I'm talking about and how I'm saying things and all that kind of stuff.
I love that. That is great. Well, Koopa, I wanted to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I learned a lot. I'm sure everybody listening learned a lot too. So thank you for coming on to talk about WoRP and everything else. Can you just let everybody know where they can find you and then what you have going on exactly?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter or X or whatever it's called at this point, at Dynasty Koopa. The WoRP tool is over at southharmonff.com. So go on there, check that out. I guess you will have just missed the sale of draft season where you could get 20% off, but I'm sure there was other things going on. As I'm learning, website management, you get to learn all sorts of cool things about, like, oh, this is how you run sales, and you do banners to tell everyone there is a sale going on and stuff like that. And you can also go on to patreon.com/South Harmon to get access to the Patreon, and the South Harmon Discord is where I hang out. You go on there, you ping me, and I will see it and I will respond to you. It is one of those things where it's just like, that is, Discord is my social media. I don't hang out on Twitter that much. I check it here and there, but I don't hang out on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok or any of that kind of stuff. I'm hanging out on Discord. It's usually the South Harmon one, and you'll see me chatting it up all the time in there. And that's really the best way to get a hold of me. If you're like, hey, I gotta ask Koopa this question, like, just find me on Discord. My Discord handle is Koopatroopa8. If you can't get into the South Harmon Discord, just send me a message there. Send me a message on Twitter, whatever. Like, I am always open to talking to people, whether it's WoRP or not, whether it's something else fantasy related. I'm always down to answer questions.
That's so great. And the pricing over there, I saw what the pricing is. It's pretty funny. If you guys go look at $6.90 monthly and $69 annually. That's clever.
I mean, it fits right in. I mean, the whole South Harmon, South Harmon Institute of Technology from Accepted, like, all of that. You just keep rolling with it, and even the Discord. Mike was talking about it, his episode of the $1 a month to get in. Like, it's just, hey, what can happen to just, like, got to get people in the door, but also make it simple. And so when we were going through, okay, what should the WoRP tool be? It was like, well, we were debating, like, do we want it to be $10? Do we want it to be $5? We're like, what's the right value for this? We're like, you know what? Kind of shoot the middle. Yeah, $6.90 is kind of funny. Let's do that.
Kind of funny.
And that's how that came to be. And the fun thing is about fantasy is you make it your own. You not everything needs to be serious. You can cultivate it to the kind of audience you want. The reason I was always attracted to the South Harmon guys, and the reason I latched on with them, is because they're doing fantasy, but they aren't being serious and corporate about it. It's a group of guys hanging out, having a good time, and oh yeah, we like this fantasy football thing. And so that's what I've always been a part of, and that's what has drawn me there and kept me here. And so if you're going out, if you're thinking about starting something up, be yourself. If you are if you want to be a more serious show, be a more serious show. If you want to laugh and joke around, laugh and joke around. Don't feel like you have to emulate the somebody else just because, oh, that's what the big person is. Being genuine, being yourself is much, much more important, because that's A, something sustainable, and B, something that people are going to gravitate to, and you're going to get yourself the kinds of people you want to be around.
Definitely true. All right, everyone. I know it's that time. We got to go. I know. Make sure that you continue to be yourself. Like Koopa said, go check Koopa stuff out too. Please, please, please let Koopa know you listen. Also, come back next week for another episode of Get Real with Kacey Kasem. And remember to stay rad.
Get real. Time to get real, everybody.